Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of All the Good Men. Today, we have Eric Uresk, who is a mindset coach who helps professional men create clarity out of chaos. He is a retired MMA fighter and MMA coach, and he made a name for himself coaching some of the best athletes in MMA as the head coach of the Fuck It Top team. And as a lifelong martial artist, Eric pulls from his lengthy martial arts experience, emotional intelligence leadership training, as well as shadow EFT to serve his clients. Sober for nearly 20 years, Eric overcame a tumultuous childhood to turn his life around and is often asked to speak to share his story of redemption. So I wanted to have Eric on this episode because he is such an incredible example of a beautiful, wonderful man who has really gone through a lot in his life. Eric, I shared a little bit with you that part of why I wanted to have you here is because you have this quality of like depth of emotional intelligence, depth of self reflection, interest in connection, but it's coming from this really grounded quality that really only comes from working with struggle, working through really needing to face yourself in some really profound ways. So I would love for you to share with us a little bit just about your story. How did you go from having this rough, tumultuous childhood to having substance abuse issues, being in jail, being homeless, then being an MMA fighter, being a martial artist, and now being an emotional intelligence coach?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you. Thank you for the intro and thank you for having me here. So, I grew up in a home that was really unsafe, emotionally and sometimes physically, but emotionally more than anything. And what I mean by unsafe is that I had a mother that catastrophized everything and was just in complete turmoil almost seemingly all the time. Right? She was never really emotionally present, and any challenges that came up were just too much for her. She always seemed overwhelmed. And I had an alcoholic, abusive father, super verbally, emotionally abusive, occasionally physically abusive. And so there was a constant impending threat in my environment all the time. There was not a safe adult to go to for anything. So I spent a lot of time riding my bike outside. Just that's the place I felt the most free, was far away from home as possible. And like I would go, and my parents, they had rules for sure. They had probably too many rules, and I would intentionally break curfew just because. And I didn't know this at the time, but I just did not feel safe going home. So it was actually worth it to get in trouble being home much later than I was supposed to, because it was like my early way of getting high and escaping was to just be out as far away from home as possible. And I didn't have any role models, so I learned the mold of being a man as I took it was from 80s action movies, right? So that's what really like raised me in terms of manhood. It was like Sylvester Stallone and Arnold Schwarzenegger and Jean-Claude Van Damme. Like those were my male role models. And so what do you learn there is like, okay, these guys go through some struggle. Maybe they even get picked on a little bit, and then they learn how to fight. And then once they learn how to fight, they kick everyone's ass. They get the girl at the end, and everybody loves them, right? And they're a hero. It's like, all right, that's what I got to do. I got to figure out how to do that. And I was this tiny little kid, and I got a couple of bullying incidences as I was riding my bike around my neighborhood and getting jumped by kids and beat up. And it wasn't the physical pain, it was the helplessness, right? And it was the same kind of helplessness I felt at home. I felt helpless in my house. Particularly with, like, if my father was being abusive towards my mother, I would also feel helpless. And so I was like, all right, I'm gonna be the toughest person that I can become. And so we didn't have the money to like afford martial arts lessons. So I remember like I would go to the book fair. I don't know if they even have book fairs anymore, but they used to have book fairs if you're like in your 40s, right, in school.
I
And
remember
you'd go
those.
and books. And I remember I would get these like martial arts books, and then I would go practice the moves that I learned in the books on my brother. And then I was just out getting into street fights like endlessly. And I remember keeping meticulous track. It was very important to me to keep track of these fights that I was getting into, because I was building myself an identity. I didn't know that at the time, right? So, but I remember how important it was to me the amount of fights that I was getting into. And so my life was not going on a positive track. I didn't really see that. By the time I was in high school, I was a full blown alcoholic and drug addict by like 14 or 15, and trouble started to come along with that. I was dropped out of school by 17, living mostly either homeless, uh, in a mental institution, in some sort of state care facility or jail. Uh, I did manage to wrestle a couple of years in high school, and that was important. The first 2 years that I was allowed in high school, and then once I got removed, I was just out there robbing drug dealers every day, and that's like continuing to build this character. And I thought like, oh, if I could get everybody to be scared of me, then I can feel safe. And the girls never came during high school because what I didn't realize was like when you're doing all this crazy stuff, it actually is scary to women to be that overtly violent, and so that kind of backfired and uh, built a lot of hangups around that. And
Yeah.
so um, I was extra lonely, extra self-loathing, inebriated to the point of oblivion as often as possible on whatever I could get my hands on. Nearly died, was nearly murdered, almost got ran over by a train, passed out on some train. It was horrendous, right? So super super chaotic. I started going to 12-step meetings when I was 15. I think I hit my first 12-step meeting,
Wow.
and I got sober when I was 23. And once I got sober, I started training martial arts more seriously, and I was training before that. I would have long bouts of sobriety before I could finally completely remove myself from that environment. And so I knew, okay, I'm going to get sober and I'm going to pursue this martial arts thing to the fullest capacity. That's all I got, and it's the only thing that gave me hope the entire time was my obsession with combat sports. The UFC was a thing, but it was like a very fringe thing at the time. I would actually I was dropped out of school, and I would go into the school while I was dropped out to use the computer lab to research martial arts because it was so fascinating to me uh, at the time. And so that was my
Yeah.
hope, was that I can hold on to this thing. And I didn't know martial arts was going to take me all over the world, give me a career and and a life path. But at the
Yeah.
time, it was just an identity that I just it's all I had. It's all I had to cling to.
Wow. Wow. Yeah. And it's so powerful to hear just that it stemmed from this need to protect yourself, this need to take
Mhm.
care of yourself, this need to if I am scary to everybody else, if I create this identity where people are afraid of me, then they can't hurt me. And then it ended up turning into something really beautiful.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
I'm curious about so now you work as an emotional intelligence coach. You
Mhm.
do so much work around understanding your emotions, around um, taking responsibility for emotions. And I'm really curious about how being a fighter and also being a martial artist influenced your capacity to access your emotions, because I often see in my work with men that there are kind of like two directions where there's either specifically with the emotion of anger or aggression, where it's either really really intense and kind of unchecked, or it's totally inaccessible because of men not wanting to be destructive or
Right.
be super angry. And so I'm curious about how you've been able to integrate those emotions, those sensations, those feelings through fighting, through martial arts, what that looks like now for you, and also maybe which emotions or feelings were more challenging for you to access, and that you've had to do different types of work in order to
Sure.
access.
Oh, that's a great question, actually. So, believe it or not, a lot of my street violence was definitely rooted in anger, but it was a very cold, calculated type of anger. Rarely did you see me lose my temper. Um, as I started to get trained, there was actually almost no anger involved in what
Huh.
I was doing at all. It was
Interesting.
yeah. So when things get stressful, particularly like, man, I've been in some like near like cars just spinning out of control and like near could be very dangerous situations, and everything kind of slows down for me and gets very calm and crystal. So, uh, and I worked as a doorman in some pretty violent clubs in New York throughout my 20s. And same thing when knives were out and things were getting crazy, everything would slow down for me. There was zero anger involved
Mm.
in it at all. And actually, to be an effective martial artist, I think that anger is something that needs to be tempered, right? So I think anger
Yeah.
is absolutely a valuable emotion in many ways, not the most valuable in times of chaos, unless you need to summon up some power from somewhere within you. Then it could be useful, right? So it's knowing when it's appropriate and when to use it. I think that's really important. That being said, fear was ever present because and it's one of so I was
Mm.
super physically talented as an athlete, very mentally and emotionally weak because I was fighting to protect an identity. And so every time I stepped in the cage or even a training session, my identity, my sense of self was on the line essentially. And so the threat of losing what I felt like was the right to feel this certain way or project this certain character, right, would be constantly
Yeah.
threatened. And it actually really hindered my career massively. It wasn't until the end of my career that I got honest with myself and said, and had a hard look in the mirror and had to come to terms with the fact that I had been a coward a good portion of my life,
Mm.
that I was afraid and that I avoided things that made me afraid. And everything that I
Mm.
did was to create a sense of control. And it was not an
Right.
easy thing to admit to myself, but it was really necessary to say, because there are acts of cowardice in the world, right? And it's not about being judgmental. It's about, okay, if I turn around from fear, that is an act of cowardice, right? And it's like, okay, well, what's behind that? Well, I didn't know that there was a lack of safety there for me to do these things at the time. It was just I had to
Mm.
come to terms with that in my own way at the time. And once I did that, I started to see like the value of moving towards fear. Uh, at first, it was very much what I call like the ice bath method of dealing with fear. Just fucking jump into the fear and until you're not scared anymore, and very much like a David Goggins type of mentality, which I'm not a huge fan of these days. But at the time, that was my easiest understanding. Was just all right. If I'm running from fear and that's creating one set of obstacles, let me move towards fear. And I started
Right.
coaching my athletes like that. Uh, Now, not very trauma informed at the time, and didn't realize that it was a tool, not the only tool. So I
Right.
definitely overused that tool with people that were not ready for that, and perhaps with myself at times. Uh, and so when you're talking about like particular emotional states or mindsets that were, well, I think vulnerability was probably the biggest one, right? So vulnerability is to let somebody see me honestly, right? So like truly and deeply let somebody see past uh, uh, more inward layers, right? So more honest, more deep layers that may be protected, right? That we don't show everybody. Uh,
Right.
as I became willing to be more vulnerable, that really opened up all the rest of it for me. Okay, but the
Right.
vulnerability had to be met with compassion,
Mhm.
because just being vulnerable without compassion doesn't work. And that's where I failed as a fight coach early, is that the compassion and the vulnerability wasn't there. I just wanted guys to walk into fear, right? Because
Right.
that's what was working for me. And whatever, I was resourced enough to do that for whatever time. Not everybody else was.
Right.
So I think that, and it's an ever expanding journey into what vulnerability actually means for me, and to
Yeah.
deepen that in more places of my life. And you know
Yeah.
because as a kid, like vulnerability, like in the street, will get you fucking killed. Like it's like very, very frowned
Totally.
upon to show any weakness. That will get you hurt at the very least. So uh, to show that felt like you were exposing yourself to really extreme danger. And I was fortunate enough to
Yeah.
meet mentors and be trained into the fact that vulnerability is actually my greatest power. It's actually what I built a six-figure coaching business from vulnerability. And it's been the greatest asset that I have.
Yeah. Yeah. And when you said it has to be met with compassion, for you, was that it had to be met with compassion, with your own compassion, or the compassion of people around you, or both?
Well, I think both, but it has to start with my compassion, right? So I can't
Right.
necessarily guarantee that the world's going to give me compassion. It's obviously it's
Right.
great when it does, but I can meet myself with compassion as often as possible. And
Yeah.
if I'm going to be a leader, it's essential that I meet others with compassion.
Yeah. Yeah. And having I like to sort of like in internal work, particularly in an internal emotional work, really look at the different parts of ourselves. And I find that that can sometimes be such an access point to compassion, where if I think about it as just, this is me doing this thing, it can be a little challenging. But when it's like, oh, there's this part of me who is
Absolutely.
acting in this way,
Yeah.
and treat that aspect of myself as a friend, it helps sometimes to bridge that gap of compassion.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think like one thing I've been talking about to my clients a lot lately is to understand that we have the capacity to hold all this type of polarity or duality, right? So, yes, do I have the potential to be a coward? Absolutely, I've done it. I also have the potential to be courageous because I've done that too. It's not like
Right.
because I've engaged in an action or a behavior, that's not the totality of who I am, right? So, um, the fact that I have choice in what I who I choose to be now, like that's where the real power comes from. And I had
Right.
it was a long process of stepping out of these identities that what I've done or who I've been is who I am or who I'm, doomed to be
Right.
per se.
Right, and to be able to be both ends of the spectrum, and to also have compassion and as much acceptance as possible for ourselves when we're on either end of the spectrum.
Yeah. Hold it all with love, right? If
Yeah.
I can hold all that with love, if I have the capacity to hold all that with love, then I am free. There's a greater sense of freedom to access choice and whatever's needed in a given situation.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm curious, you spoke about the compassion that was so important for you to be able to feel in regards to your vulnerability.
Mhm.
And I'm curious, in when people are feeling this intense fear, or when people are feeling, when your clients, when you talk to men who are feeling really really intensely, or are completely shut down from their emotions, from their capacity to feel that fear, to feel that anger, to feel whatever is there, what are some well, actually, we'll start with this question, which is, what are some of the main challenges that you see with the men that you work with in terms of emotional patterning, access points to emotional intelligence, and all of that? What are
So
some of the main points, some of the main challenges that you see
yeah, I
when
love that question. So, and it's actually funny because I do work with a few women as well, and the women that I work with are often,
Mhm.
we'll say, carrying what's referred to as a masculine shield, right? And so they often run into the same problems
Yeah.
that a lot of the guys run into, in that you ask them what they're feeling
Mhm.
and they look up when I initially meet them, right? And I always find that so
Hmm.
interesting. Especially, I'll go do these trainings where I facilitate in Las Vegas and emotional intelligence trainings, and you're getting a room full of people that most of them haven't done any work on themselves yet, right? So this is like a baseline entry level thing, and same thing, when you
Yeah.
ask somebody how they're feeling or how they feel about something, they start looking up as if they have, like they're going to their mind
Right.
instead of what's
Mhm.
embodied in that moment. And so, yeah, getting a client to understand the difference between their thoughts and their experience, right? So thoughts are part of the experience. So the way that I
Yeah.
break it down is your experience at any given time is thoughts, feelings, physical sensations, any given time, right? So if I was to say, Fabi, I'm going to give you $1 million, right? Like it's the $1 million is whatever. It's how you feel about the $1 million, what you interpret about the $1 million that's going to create your experience. Okay, and so creating an understanding about what completely encompasses your experience, so that you can begin to be present to what your experience is. If you're
Right.
understanding of your experience is limited to your thoughts, and you don't know what you're feeling and you don't have access to describe what you're feeling, it's going to be really challenging to go into the emotional body and start to pull out the stories and stuff like that. So we could always start with thoughts, sure. I think one of the simple ways that I get men to understand, or anybody that I work with, is I just ask them to close their eyes and I ask them to see if they know what it feels like for their body to say no, right? So they can ask their body, what does it feel like to experience no, right? And what does it feel like to experience yes? And 99 times out of 100, right, the no feels contractive, while the yes feels a little bit more open and expansive, or a lot more open and expansive, right? And so they can make a clear distinction between those two things. Then I say, well, great, now you have the potential to understand
Right.
your inner world. And if I want to really simplify it, I mean, those are really two of that's the experience that we're having in our inner world, one way or another. There's an opening or a contraction, and we can throw some different labels on some nuance of what that looks like. But I think more or less that's basically it. And if you can do that simple thing, then you can feel your emotions, you can feel your feelings. We can start to get the beliefs and the stories, and then we can get to work.
Yeah, that's something that I see so much in my work with men. I see it in my work with women as well, particularly when there's that, like you just said, that masculine shield. But I see this so much in my work with men where there's this uh, people struggling with I'm up in my head. I'm up in my head, whether that's in sex or in stuck emotions. This being stuck up in the head, up in the thoughts, which also makes so much sense for a lot of reasons. One, because often those emotions are scary to feel, and it feels safer to be up in the head. Also, men are it's kind of drilled into men from a very early age that you shouldn't feel your emotions, that it's not safe to feel your emotions, that it makes you weak or that it makes you dangerous, or a whole variety of things about why you shouldn't feel your
Hmm.
emotions, why it's not safe to be vulnerable in them or to feel them or to express them at
Absolutely.
all. And so then we're wondering, well, why are men up in their heads? It makes so much sense. It's like this has been put into structure for so long and on a societal level. And I love what you just said around helping men just feel, well, what does your no feel like? Because so often I think we can sometimes think that we don't have access to our feelings or that we are completely shut down, when actually it's just sort of like creating the body mind connection that is sometimes simpler than we think. And so knowing what does a yes feel like versus what does a no feel like. When you see that piece of cake, are you a yes or a no? What
Right.
does that feel
Yeah.
like in your body? When you are drawn to somebody, when you are attracted to somebody, what does a yes feel like? What does a no feel like? What does a yes sexually but a no emotionally
Hmm.
feel like? And getting more and more sort of into the fine details of those sensations, and even just what's the literal physical sensation, because sometimes I'll ask people, okay, what are the sensations you're feeling in your body? And they'll say something like sadness, or um, or I'm not really sure, or I don't feel anything. And so with that, it's like, okay, if it's sadness, well, what does that sadness feel like? Does it feel like a heaviness in your chest? Does it feel like a pressure behind your eyes? Does it feel like does it actually feel like numbness? What is that? What's sort of the texture of that numbness? Is it spacious? Is it gray? And getting into more of those details sometimes helps to create that body mind connection that can feel like a huge jump, where it's like, I don't know how to access my emotions, I don't know how to feel that, that's not safe to feel that. And it's really just coming into the body scan, into the little details, even of just like I can feel my shirt on my
Hmm.
skin, is such a bridge to finding that connection.
I think like as you're articulating that, I'm like, yeah, it's really like it's just a lack of know-how, right? I think for so long,
Yeah.
my particularly like my parents' generation, like and generations before that, they didn't have access to a lot of information. And working class, middle class, East Coast people from New York, like my family, like, they had access to none of this stuff, right? It was like, and so I'm like,
Yeah.
man, we're so lucky to live in an age where we have access to information. It's like, I believe it is our job as men to like start teaching this stuff, like why is it important to feel your feelings? Well, it's important for this reason. If you don't have access to your feelings, this is scientifically proven, right? They're making decisions for you with or without your permission, right? So I've seen the studies conservatively at like 80%, as high as like 95% of anybody's decision making is really based off feelings at the end of the day, right? So they'll take the information, and then the feeling that they get based off the information is what's making the decision most of the time. So your emotions are making decisions for you all the time. Do you want to have a say in what decisions they're making, right? So even if we just look at it from this very practical place, that's pretty friggin' important.
Yeah, and I feel like the our unwillingness and resistance to feeling emotion, unwillingness, resistance, and also just like lack of know-how in how to really be with emotion, it can lead to those two different directions that we were talking about, where it's like either there's this reactivity, so okay, I'm feeling anger and now I'm yelling at somebody, or now I'm packing all my things and leaving, or now I'm getting aggressive and violent, where there's this reactivity because it's like there's not a capacity to be with that feeling internally, so we've got to do something
Absolutely.
about it. And and I think, we all have had some experience of this. And then there's the other side where it's like, I'm just going to shut it all
Yep.
down. I'm just going to shut this all down. I'm going to not feel it. I'm going to turn it off. And so then these are both a function of the same need to be safe, to not to attempt to not feel the thing that is horribly uncomfortable, and increasing our capacity to experience, well, what is the sensation, what is the feeling of anger, of jealousy, of grief. Can I sit in it for just a moment longer? Can I be with it internally for just a little bit more, so that I have a say, so that I'm making choices based on my truth, based on my integrity, rather than based on a knee jerk reaction to an emotion that is so fucking intense to feel.
Absolutely. Yeah. 100%.
So I've got another question for you, which is about your martial arts. And my curiosity here is,
Sure.
with martial arts, how has that impacted how you show up as a partner, as a husband, as a lover? This is something that, when I was getting really serious with Jeff, with my partner, my dad asked me, like, what do you think is it? What do you think is one of the reasons why this is like your person? What is it that makes him so good as a partner? And I thought about it and I was like, I think his kung fu training. I think that really impacts how he shows up as a partner, as a lover. So I'm curious how your martial arts training has impacted who you are as a man, as a lover, as a partner, as a
Sure. Oh,
husband.
I love that question. Actually, I don't think I've ever been asked that question before, but I like it. So this is actually great because it's something I've been thinking about a lot. And you and I were chatting a little bit before the call about when you're in some new age circles, right? Like the men that we'll have that will be in a lot of these circles, they're a certain type of way, right? And not to put a value judgment on it, but if you're listening to this and you immediately think of a type of man that you run into in more new age stuff, because a lot of what we're talking about, masculine, feminine, and emotions, it is very much a heavy component of like the more new age circles, right? And a lot of things that we enjoy and are really cool about following our consciousness lie in these circles, and we will cross paths with that. And not always the most grounded energy in my experience, right? So, because I have a relationship with violence, there is a calmness to me. Now, it doesn't mean I am a violent person, right?
Yeah.
I will be the first person to try to get out of conflict as fast as possible. I have zero desire to get into a fist fight at this stage of the game in my life. I'm 43 years old, right? However, if I needed to, it would not be something that I want to do. It would not be something that I take lightly. If it was needed, the capacity to be violent, to protect, would be there in less than a snap of a finger, right? And so I have, I walk anywhere on this earth, and very rarely do I feel in danger. And if I do feel in danger,
Yeah.
it's for a good reason, right? It's because, like, yeah, you're in a dangerous place,
Mhm.
and you at least need to have your spidey senses on in that moment. So I feel safe in my body because of that, and because I feel safe in my body pretty much wherever I am on this earth. My wife feels safe, and I can carry that, yeah, that embodiment of safety. I think it's really important actually for men to have a relationship with violence. Doesn't mean you have to be violent. Doesn't even really mean you need to know how to
Mhm.
fight. Although I think it's helpful to be trained in that, because what martial arts training does, right? Okay, now it exposes you to varying degrees of violence, right? So even just like when we're practicing, right? Yes, we're doing it safely most of the time in a way where we're trying to make sure nobody gets hurt. However, it's important to see how you respond to the chaos of hand-to-hand combat or weapons training or any of this stuff, and like, because it really, it's a mirror. It reflects back to you where you're at with certain things, right? And it will expose to you fears that you may have, and insecurities that
Yeah.
you may have. And so because of the, I think violence and sex, right, they're these heightened states that it's easy to be unconscious in, but if you can bring consciousness into them, you can learn more about yourself faster than you would in just, I think, everyday life, because they are such heightened states and they're so personal, and they, a lot of our identity from a primal level, I think, is tied into a lot of that stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. That's one of my favorite practices that I do with the men that I work with is hones in on, okay, how do I access that feeling of violence, that feeling of aggression, even that feeling of protection, wanting to protect, wanting to fight for a cause? How do I integrate that with my presence, with my heart? And then that desire to fuck, that like very primal sexual desire, how do I create a safe place for that where I can then also integrate that and come to that with my full presence, with my full heart? And I think it's so, so, so important because those are really two of the access points to our deepest power, men and women. But we'll say specifically right now for men, there's this access point to these really primal, powerful parts of ourselves that oftentimes get shut down, and often for good reason, right? Because if we don't grow up with examples of really healthy aggression or healthy versions of sexuality, it makes a lot of sense that those would sort of get tucked away, or come out in unintegrated ways. And so I think what you're speaking to is so, so, so important, that that capacity to access those intensities of sensation in the body and experience in this life, and to come to them with integrity, with presence, with love.
Yeah, and I just want to speak to something, and I think it's appropriate for the podcast, is that just because you can fight, right, doesn't mean you have a healthy relationship with violence, right? There are men that are quick to violence that can
Mm,
fight, and I think that if you're quick to violence, that tells me that you're afraid, right? That's a fearful response to those that get quick to
mhm.
violence. Like, violence in most cases needs to be a last, that's the last resort, is that we're going to go to physical violence, right? Unless, like, yeah, we're in some really clearly life threatening situation that would change the circumstances there. It's also like, it says a lot about people's conflict resolution skills, right, and their ability to be with emotional discomfort, right? So I think, like, one of the things that is, I think, confusing a lot of men today, the old, what I call like the 1950s model of masculinity is definitely, well, it's not popular. There's particularly in a lot of circles, right? There's like, yeah, the more conscious you go, I think the more you're going to find well, we definitely don't want, like, yeah, the 1950s TV show version of masculinity. Um, so much so that a lot of guys have gotten feminized, right? So they kind of, they've adopted a little bit more feminine traits. I think, like, man, there's so much room to go in the middle, because I still think it's important for men to create physical safety, but even more, especially in this day and age, important for them to create emotional safety, right? And not emotional
Mhm,
safety in the way that a
mhm.
woman feels with another woman, right? But emotional safety, like the same way a guy can make a woman feel physically safe, I think it's important for a man to make his woman feel that way emotionally, if that makes sense. So there's a
Mm.
little bit of
Mhm.
a context difference to that, right? So think about how you feel with like your best girlfriends is probably different than how you feel with Jeff, I would imagine.
Right. 100%.
Yeah,
Totally.
and the safety that he creates in both of those ways, if you can like just feel that for a moment, like think about, oh, is that different than the safety that I feel with my girlfriends when we're talking about something deep? And that's what they're confused about.
Right. It's like what does safety look like?
Mhm.
And what does it look like to actually integrate our aggression, anger, violence, whatever flavor of that you want to say? How do we integrate that so we actually become safer?
Mhm.
Because if it's unintegrated, then when it does come out, then it's not safe, or it never comes out, and then we're disconnected from our inner power. And yeah, finding a different way to actually be in touch with those aspects of ourselves, again, as women and men, to be able to be in touch with the full spectrum of being. And that's part of why I really love having this conversation with you, is that there is this full spectrum nature. There is this I think for those of us who can sometimes seem like seemingly paradoxes, where it's like I fight, and I do emotional intelligence coaching. I have this experience of life, and I have this experience of life, and it all comes together here in the body. It all comes together in being able to be with myself and being able to be with the two poles of every experience, of the coward and of the courage, of the, I like to put fear and courage on the two ends of that spectrum. And to, I think that's such an inspiring way to be, is to not need to form an entire identity around yourself of protection in one direction or the other, right? I'm this like super soft, super quote unquote safe guy who never shows any anger um, or yeah, whatever that image looks like to you, or this image of I can't ever be vulnerable, I can't ever show my weaknesses, but to rather find what's real for you and be able to bring it all, and to be able to bring your full spectrum nature. And to me, that is courage. To me, that is being an incredible role model of what's possible, because there is no one example of a safe man. There is no one example of a good man, a healthy man, a strong man. It's like the range is vast, it's infinite. And to show how much of that infinite nature can also exist in one person. I see a lot in this sort of talk around masculine and feminine, that the man is steadfast and solid and sort of like one thing, and then the feminine is energy
Yeah,
moving
one
around.
thing.
And there are aspects to that can hold truth for sure, but it's so important to remember that we're all so full spectrum. And you in your masculinity is this like incredibly colorful, incredibly nuanced experience of life. And every man, every human will really have that um, individual way of being. And to find your naturalness and integrate the parts that are protective or based in fear or based in expectations from the past, and to really come into integrity with the emotions, and to be able to be with them internally, so that you can be this piece of art that each person is.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, it's like as I'm listening to you, like the word capacity just comes to me, right? And it's the I used to think this was like be sounds so corny, but capacity, as capacity expands, it's my ability to choose, right? It's like to not be defined by a thing. To not be defined or confined is probably an even better way to look at it. To not be confined. Uh, my wife and I, we were at uh, a very new agey party the other day, and it's fun. I love these people, and they were doing some exercise of like embodying some infancy type characteristics, and it was actually really uncomfortable. And I was like, as I'm doing this, I'm like, man, I used to rob drug dealers, and I'm sitting here doing this exercise. Like, I just lost all my street cred, and like, but it's like, then I laugh, and I'm like, how cool is it that in my lifetime I've just gotten to be and experience all these places? Like, if my homies saw me right now, they would definitely shots at me, and they'd be justified in doing so. Like, yo, I get it, right? Take all the shots you want, but but how cool to be able to experience all of that,
Yeah.
to not just be limited to
Yeah.
like the street. Yeah, like I mean, yeah, it's just such a
Mm.
limited experience, and I don't know a lot of people that stay one way their whole life that seem fulfilled to me. Right now, that could 100% just be my projection, but I don't believe we're meant to just be one way. I believe that expanding is part of the game here, right? To see more parts of
Yeah.
ourselves and to experience ourselves in new and different ways, not in forced ways, right? But like in ways that feel true. Now, one of the things I think men get stuck on is because they've never explored this and they think that they have to be one way and one identity, they shut themselves off for what's possible for them. Right? So, like
Mm.
defining and confining anything too much, it actually shuts you off from possibility. I believe it shuts you off from being able to
Mm.
entertain or experience what is possible for me. So, one thing that was really important for me is I had to let go of my story. For a long time, all I could talk about if I was meeting somebody new is I would have to find a way to tie my past into this conversation because that's the only thing
Mhm.
that's who I thought I was, and that's who I needed you to see to think that I was interesting in some way. And to be honest, like I could be very charming and
Right.
get a lot of oohs and ahs, like with my story. I could fucking wow you with my story if I want to, but you're not gonna meet me. And I started to
Right.
realize that, and I was like, first I was like, oh my god, that's so cringe that I do that. And second, I was like, then I realized where it was coming from, and I was like, oh, I just don't have any other identity. Like I really convinced myself I have to be this. And I think a lot of men, they either
Mm.
convince themselves they have to be this, or they're not what they think they should be, and they feel a lot of shame around it.
Loving the full spectrum nature of it, and breaking the barriers of not only our own imagery of ourselves, our own self-imposed identity, but also how people view us, how people see what people expect, and the fact that you can rob drug dealers and then you can be rolling around like a baby on the floor with a bunch of
So
people, like the
embarrassing.
the full spectrum, the extent of the capacity to, and the word I'm really looking for here is the humility of being willing to experience all of yourself,
Yeah,
the humility, the courage, and the vulnerability, and the bravery, and and also the joy of really being able to just experience it all. um,
absolutely.
I have, for throughout my whole life, I've really felt like a chameleon in many ways. I grew up going between two houses that were very, 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 very different, and I would sort of shapeshift in order to be who I needed to be in each place. And I,
Right.
in throughout school, had like different friend groups, and I would sort of switch to be in each of those. And for a while I had this feeling of like, who even am I? Like, how do I find what's real for me? What is natural for me? Who am I? And I realized, like, oh, I'm all of it. I can be
Yeah.
comfortable in places where people, so many, like this whole friend group would be so uncomfortable over there. I can go to places, I can be around people, I can be in scenarios where somebody else who comes from a place, a family that I come from, might feel so uncomfortable in that situation. And I can feel totally comfortable there. And that's not because I'm pretending to be somebody that I'm not. It's because I'm just accessing a different part of
Yeah.
myself. It's the same with different archetype work, right? When we try and embody a specific archetype, maybe we're trying to embody the king or the warrior. It's not about pretending to be somebody we're not. It's really about accessing the extent of our being, accessing the different parts of ourselves that show up when we're in this super weird situation, that shows up when we are in a church of people singing really powerful gospel songs, or we're on this like bizarre train in India and everyone's like very looking at you weird, at like all these different places in life where we can become who we need to be. We become an aspect of ourselves that exists within us, and we get to experience that by allowing space for that um, malleability.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like, well, what do I want to bring into this situation, right? And
Right.
what's needed, what do I want to experience, and then I get to play with that. Like the yeah, man, being confined to one specific way of doing things all the time because that's who I'm supposed to be. It's like I don't know. I don't get a lot of joy living like that, and I did it for a long time.
Yeah.
And I did it because I thought I had to. I did not know that there was another option. I didn't know any of this, and I didn't know any of this because I wasn't aware of what to be looking for. Uh,
Right.
in myself of how I'm confining myself to these limitations and based off my old story and
Right.
my past experiences. And I think it's really one of the most beautiful things that I can experience is supporting to open up somebody else to what's possible for them as well. That like, okay, just because you've been experiencing life a certain way does not mean you are predetermined to experience it that way or yourself that way for eternity. Like there are other possibilities if you
Absolutely.
learn how to choose them. And I don't think everybody has access to choice if they're unconscious, right? So I'm sympathetic to that. I think that's why mentorship is really important. So the
Right.
more men, women that are out there showing, teaching, guiding others into how to access these other parts of themselves, like that's the work that's really needed. It's actually one of the reasons, like
Yeah.
I'm very tentative about like AI and stuff like that because there's going to be
Yeah.
men that well, you know what, fuck dealing with women. I'll just go into this virtual world and get the most beautiful woman that I want, right? And so getting further out of their
Right.
bodies, further disconnect, completely in
Mhm.
mind, right? Completely in mind and completely put into this disembodied state. And then they're going to figure out what a lot of people figure out is getting the things that you want is not going to make you happy, right? You can like I womanized like nobody's business during my 20s and early 30s and just went through every pleasure scenario that you can imagine and did all the things and it was
Right.
so fucking lonely and horrible, right? And it was all in the mind. Literally all of it as I look back now, I was completely trapped in my head. I lived this amazing rock star lifestyle all over the world and I didn't get to enjoy any of it because I was up
Right.
here. So I refuse to give up the embodiment, like the practice of going into my body and having the experience here and like seeing what's true for me here. Not that I ignore my mind. My mind's still very important to me, but I don't want to live solely from the mind, and I don't want to live solely from the confines of the mind. I think it's really important that we create that relationship with our internal world.
I think it's of utmost importance right now, and it's happening.
Yeah.
It's happening. Speaking of which, um, I'd love to hear just about what the work is that you're doing and how people can find you if they're curious to hear more about you, if they're curious to work with you. How can people track you down? How can they keep
Sure.
up to date with what you're working on?
Yeah, so the easiest way to find me is on my Instagram, Eric the Gentleman. I also have a podcast that I just released, No Nonsense with Eric Uresk. So that is my podcast. It's on all major streaming platforms. The work, so I do a pretty intensive mentorship. Most of my work is one on one at this point. I've done group offerings in the past. I probably will do group offerings in the future. I really enjoy one on one work, uh, and it's pretty immersive. So I, you know, clients come to me with various different places in life and what they want to accomplish, and getting them present to, how to master themselves so that they can begin mastering the outside, right? So there's a big difference between the content of your life and the context in which you live it, right? So the content is the stuff, your husband, your boyfriend, your girlfriend, your job, your kids, your house, all the things, the stuff in our life. And then there's the context, the lens in which we view it through, right? How we see our life, how we experience our life. The content can and always will change. Um, and even when the content changes, the context doesn't change. You will invariably experience life the same way, right? And so,
Mm.
what I support people doing is creating a context that works for them. I don't have a concern of what the context is. Like, whatever, however you want to experience your life, that's what I want for you, right? And I will support you in doing that. It's, we meet weekly for calls, and then I also give my clients a lot of access to me outside of calls, because I find that reaching out in between calls, they send me voice notes. I'll be like, I want you to just notice when you're telling yourself this story about your wife this week, right? Whenever you get
Mm-hmm.
aggravated with your wife, right? I want you to notice what the thoughts, feelings, and physical sensations are. And I want you to drop me a voice note.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So now they're out there in the field, right? As I call it, and they're getting coaching on the field. And then I can,
Yeah.
cool. Sometimes I don't have anything to say about what they're noticing. Sometimes I may have further direction for them of what to do with what they notice. Well, what do you resist about that? Right. And we go deeper than I can, on an hour and a half call once a week. So,
Absolutely.
uh,
Yeah, I think that those voice notes are those are one of my favorite parts of both with my clients and also with the coaches that I've worked with, because it gives you this access point to not like, okay, what's the topic that I'm going to come to our session with only, but like in real time, like you've got them in your back pocket, and it's so incredibly valuable to have that support for a set amount of time where it's like I'm actively working on my entire way of looking at the world and relating, and to have someone support with that is so powerful.
immersion. I think anybody that I know that has gotten results in any facet of personal growth or on a new challenge, they've taken ownership first, right? If there's no ownership, I don't know what to tell the person, right? So there's got to be a sense of ownership, and generally that immersion will follow ownership, right? I don't think you're going to see people
Mhm.
immerse themselves in something they haven't taken ownership over, right? So if it does take that
Right.
ownership, then they
Right.
dive in and make it a part of, right? It's integrating, right? It's like you could go have a
Mhm.
plant medicine experience and they're great. If you don't integrate what you received, for following that, then it's just another peak experience that you had. You may as well just
Yeah.
drop Molly and go to a club if that's what you do. So
Right.
if we want to keep these experiences, if we want to keep these learnings, keep these trainings, whatever they are, the integration process is everything. Make it
Yeah.
a part of. That's what integration is, right? So, like, how do we do that? Well, as far as I know, my best understanding is to immerse ourselves in something so it becomes a part of.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. Well, I so appreciate what you're doing, the work that you're doing in this world. Thank you for doing what you do. It's really so needed. It's so important. It's so, so, so valuable. And I'm so glad that you're out there doing what you do. It's been such a pleasure just to hear about your story a little bit more in depth, and to hear where you're able, how you support people, and your thoughts on the full spectrum experience of being a man and of being in existence. So thank you, thank you, thank you, Eric. So, so great to chat with you.
Thanks for having me.